Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto, welcome to day one of Absolutely Interdisciplinary 2022. My name is Monique Critchlow, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Schwartz Reisman Institute. Founded in 2019, the Schwartz Reisman Institute's mission is to ensure that powerful technologies like artificial intelligence make the world a better place for everyone by integrating cutting-edge research across traditional boundaries to inspire and build human-centered solutions. Before we begin today, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. These and other Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island developed complex and effective governance systems that incorporated values based on respect for human life and the intelligence of the natural world. When Indigenous land wasn't ceded through good faith efforts, it was often stolen, and their governance systems were disrupted by colonialism and replaced with treaty arrangements. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, who are working to reclaim their rights to self-determination and self-governance. We need to protect and honor the history and the people of these places, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. Although we may all be joining from different places today, we encourage you to reflect on the history and relations of the land that you live and work on. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share. Please note that today's session is being recorded. We'll also have the Zoom chat open throughout the day, and we encourage folks to use the chat to engage with each other. At the end of each session, there will be a moderated Q&A, and that will also be an opportunity for folks to participate and ask questions. At that time, if you feel comfortable turning on your camera, we'd invite you to do so. Questions during the Q&A can be asked by raising your virtual hand or just placing them in the chat. And if you need any assistance throughout the day, please look for folks with from the SRI technical team. You'll find them by having the SRI appended to the end of their names, but they're around the room. At this time, I'd like to invite Peter Lowen to say a few words of welcome. Peter is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, director of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and an associate director at the SRI. Peter?
Thanks very, very much, Monique, for this. Unfortunately, Julian Hadfield, who is the director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute and the Schwartz Reisman Chair, is unable to join us this year for reasons made all guests in these COVID eras. So on behalf of Julian, it really is my privilege to welcome you to Absolutely Interdisciplinary 2022. I'll just say just a few words to kick things off, and then I'll do what a good introductory speaker should do and get out of the way. But the first is that the goal of this event really is to convene leading thinkers from a rich variety of fields and to really embody that title that we've given to this conference, which is now in its second year. We think this is the best way to spark new ideas and new ways of thinking around powerful technologies and to better frame the relationship between technology and society and what it means to be human. Now, for those of you who weren't here yesterday, we commenced with an excellent workshop organized by SRI's graduate fellows centered around the theme of technologies of trust. And now we're kicking off the general conference with 2 days of exciting programming ahead of us, addressing really a wide gamut of topics that are nonetheless related. Topics from public data trust to explainable AI, social learning, the digital constitutionalism, collective agency, and recommender systems. And what I would just say to you as you listen and participate is that I'd encourage you to really think about these topics and how this research connects with your own work. And we'd invite you to really explore any new insights and paths that surface from our shared experience at this conference. And if I could just say one final thing as a person who goes to presents at and consumes at a lot of conferences, that what's a bit different about the way we're trying to do things at Absolutely Interdisciplinary is we're trying to break out of the regular conference presentation format in which, at least as a social scientist, in which the person gets up there with a deck and moves through 18 slides slowly and 5 slides extremely quickly, and then takes on some questions given by the audience and ignores any number of others because we leave 5 minutes for 35 minutes of questions, and the next speaker does the same thing. Instead, what we really want is speakers to come together and have a conversation with each other around some topics, and then to invite you into that conversation. These will be research informed, of course, and they're coming from their position of expertise. But we really want to invite you into a conversation that moves beyond disciplinary boundaries around things, but invites people to really share their knowledge and their wisdom and their insights from their own research in a way that enhances the conversation for everyone that is involved. So I'm really looking forward to these next 2 days. I hope that you are very, very much. So with that, we'll get started with our first session. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's first session, my colleague at SRI, our other associate director, one of three, Lisa Austin. Now, Lisa is a professor in the Faculty of Law. She's the chair in Law and Technology at the law school here at the University of Toronto. And her research focuses on data privacy, property law, and legal theory. And it's been cited, in fact, numerous times by Canadian courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada. And what I'll just say about my colleague Lisa before I turn it over to her there's many things that impress me about Lisa, but what really impresses me is that she gets into and knows the technical details of the systems in which with which law intersects. So she's a person who really, I think, is sensitive to the kind of diversity of knowledge one really has to have to move the needle on policy and to move the needle on these big questions that we're wrestling with. So Lisa, thanks very much for moderating the session. I'm going to turn it over to you, and the conference is now yours. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Peter. Thanks for that introduction. I would say the trick is to have lots of friends rather than lots of knowledge, but that might be another topic of conversation. So I would like to welcome everyone here to our panel, Redrawing Data Boundaries. As we outlined in the description of this panel on the SRI site, we know that there are many incentives for companies to draw tight boundaries around the data they collect and process, and there are many legal tools and even legal obligations for doing so. But here we want to ask whether we should also be developing mechanisms for and even public rights of access to data. When is data a public resource that requires a redrawing of these boundaries? And I'm really excited to have an amazing group of panelists here to give us some thoughts about this topic. I want to give a brief introduction to each, and then I'm going to invite them to start us off with some remarks. After which I'll open things up to questions. This will be a question and answer kind of panel, so feel free to throw your questions in the chat or raise your hand and I will recognize you. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Aziz Huck, who is the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. He specializes in US and comparative constitutional law, and from that public law perspective has recently been writing on the regulation of AI and data. He's widely published in top journals, also more public-facing non-specialist venues like the New York Times. He has a long list of professional accomplishments. I just wanted to highlight that he's a former director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Project, has litigated cases at the US Supreme Court, and was a law clerk to the legendary Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the Supreme Court of the United States. We also have with us Robert Seamans, who's an associate professor at New York University's Stern School of Business, where he teaches courses in game theory and strategy. Professor Siemens' research focuses on how firms use technology and their strategic interactions with each other, and also focuses on the economic consequences of AI, robotics, and other advanced technologies. His research has been widely published in leading journals, as well as other more public-facing outlets, such as the New York Times. In 2015, Professor Siemens was appointed as the senior economist for technology and innovation on President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. Also with us is Eric Horvitz, which, as many of you I'm sure probably already know, Eric is the Chief Scientific Officer at Microsoft, where he pursues his passion for harnessing computing advances to enhance the quality of people's lives. This includes efforts to harness computing frontiers in AI to advance health and welfare, bioscience, and sustainability. Outside of Microsoft, Eric has served on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology and the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board of the National Academies. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and an affiliate professor at University of Washington's School of Medicine and Computer Science and Engineering Department. And then last but definitely not least, Pam Snively, who's the Chief Data and Trust Officer at Telus here in Canada, where she leads the team responsible for data and privacy governance at Telus, For many of us in the audience who work on privacy issues, Pam needs no introduction. She's been the participant in so many of our public debates and conversations. There's a recent article entitled Canada's Privacy Leaders, 10 Inspiring Women Shaping the Data Privacy Landscape, which named her as a trailblazer, which I wholeheartedly endorse. Prior to joining Telus, Pam managed the consulting arm of Osler's privacy and data management practices, Access Privacy by Osler. And she, prior to this, provided a broad range of privacy risk management and compliance advice in the private, public, and health sectors. So a wealth of knowledge and experience here on our panel. What I want to do is get each of you start us off by reflecting on spend a few minutes outline for us whether you think there's a case to be made for others, whether it's researchers, governments, other industry players, community groups, fill in your preferred group, to have access to data that's currently controlled by tech companies. What would be some top examples for you of where this is most needed and where the benefits are, and what are the risks? And Aziz, I'll ask you to start us off.
Sure, Lisa, thank you so much. And thank you very much both to you and to the organizers of this terrific conference. I apologize for not being in Toronto in person. Maybe I can usefully tee up one aspect of this question, which is how has government employed either data or the affordances that are commonly grouped under the AI label and that are in current operation today, and whether there are missed opportunities as a consequence of the way that governments have used those informational and technological resources. My primary residence is in the United States, and my primary experience is with the US government. So what I will say briefly will focus upon the American government in particular. I suspect it's true, perhaps to lesser extents of other jurisdictions also. In my view, the manner in which both data that's generated outside of government and technologies of AI that are also by and large developed outside government have been deployed by the state have reflected the way that the state is presently conceptualized and understood. The state, at least in the American context, is best viewed as a neoliberal formation. And I don't mean to be too ideologically freighted or to use jargon when I invoke that word, but I think it's a useful word because it captures very distinctly a particular way in which the state is organized these days in the United States in particular, but also elsewhere. And this form of state organization places great weight and a lot of resources on the coercive arms or instruments of the state. Police, intelligence services, and military are generally well-funded and generally well-organized. In contrast, the regulatory or welfare-enhancing elements or armatures of the state have for the past 40 years experienced more or less exiguous financial and managerial conditions. So the state is lopsided. The helping state is weaker than the coercive state under conditions of neoliberalism. And the deployments of data and AI technologies track the way in which the state is strong in some places and the state is weak in other places. At least in the American context, in my view, the most interesting and the perhaps most developed deployments of data or technologies that come from outside government have been in the policing and in the military and intelligence sectors, particularly around predicting where police should be deployed, identifying individuals who should be subject to particular police scrutiny, or determining who should be denied or granted bail. We don't have as much transparency into military and intelligence uses but there's no question that those uses are aggressive. And my understanding from talking to people in the intelligence community is that they're largely dependent upon data and instruments that are developed outside of the federal government. In contrast, on the welfare or regulatory side, we don't see as many deployments of either data or AI. The Administrative Conference of the United States recently published a report by a number of Stanford and NYU researchers that identified some deployments. But I think it's fair to say that on the civilian side, on the non-coercive side, AI and big data tools tend to be deployed much more patchily. That pattern, I think, helps, for my purposes, answer Lisa's question by describing a series of places where the state has gone all in exploiting these technologies, and a wide variety of regulatory and welfare enhancing activities that are associated with the modern state, where we see far less deployment of either data or AI. I'd flag in closing one particular example of this, which is to think about the way in which commercially available geolocation data has or has not been used during the COVID-19 pandemic. In other jurisdictions, that data has been deployed, arguably relatively effectively, to facilitate contact tracing. And parallel deployments in the public health context, at least in the United States, which I'm most familiar with, have not been effective. And to my mind, that's symptomatic of the way that opportunity, risk, and the absence of taking advantage, the absence of deployment, have played out in the American landscape.
Thanks, Aziz. Pam, do you want to give us the view from Canada?
Sure, thanks. Lots to think about there. There is a lot to say on this topic, hard to narrow it down, but I'm going to focus today on our Telus Data for Good program. It's been pretty topical lately, and I think it's a really excellent illustration of what can be done with data for social good and with sharing with government, along with some of the pitfalls that might await us if we go further down this path. Telus launched our Data for Good program in April of 2020 because we do believe that sharing data responsibly can play a truly impactful, if not extraordinary, role in helping governments make more evidence-based decisions and informed decisions about public policy. Early in the pandemic, we realized how valuable our de-identified network mobility data could be when responding to that pandemic. Our Data for Good program operates on a data analytics program. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it operates on a data analytics program that we call Telus Insights. And we started developing that back in 2015. We had begun work then, and we had designed it to generate valuable insights from de-identified network mobility data, because we knew that very helpful information can be gleaned from large-scale movement patterns and trends, and that critically, it's not necessary to use personally identifying information to harness this value. Under the Data for Good program, we allowed scientists, and we continue to allow data scientists from our partners, including the government, to have supervised and guided access to our secure data platform that contains, again, only de-identified data sets generated from our mobility network. The de-identified data sets don't leave our system, but the data scientists are permitted to download insights or outputs of their analytics once they have been reviewed by Telus and our team to ensure that they meet the requirements of the program, which include our privacy controls, risk of re-identification. So again, to be clear, our Data for Good program does not involve the sharing of personal information, but rather de-identified data. And it's going to be, I think really important when we start to talk about, the pitfalls of sharing personal information, considering some of the things that this program encountered. For those that aren't as familiar with the term de-identified, it really is, it's used generally to reference data that was personal information at one point, likely when it was collected, and in this case, when it was collected, but that it's been transformed so that it can no longer be traced back to any one individual. And that might include and in this case does include technical transformations, technical controls, as well as some physical and administrative controls. We were very transparent about the launch of our Data for Good program in 2020 because we were actually acutely aware that it could be misunderstood. So we published a lot of information about it on our website. We did op-eds and conducted media interviews. We knew there was brand risk, but we chose to make this data available because we knew that privacy was in fact protected, and we were confident that the data could help. Today, after the fact, what we know is this: privacy was in fact protected. The program did indeed provide valuable insights to policymakers. We've heard that from the policymakers themselves. And yet, while originally received positively, more recently our Data for Good program became the subject of a parliamentary hearing and media controversy. There was a great deal of misinformation raised in both media and by MPs about the program. So what does that tell us when we're contemplating the questions that Lisa posed? It tells me anyway, citizens can easily become very concerned about government use of their personal information. I note again, we saw this great concern even though the Data for Good program doesn't even involve personal information. The nature of our democracy is that there is great risk that when any government uses citizen data, that use could become the subject of an attack from opposition parties. These things can become kind of politically weaponized, so to speak. And that makes citizen trust in government data use more challenging when we know that that controversy can be stirred up. And then another thing it tells us is that concepts of privacy controls, including de-identification, do not lend themselves to media sound bites. It is really hard to get the truth across when there is a desire for controversy. So does all of this create incentives for corporations or tech companies to share data with government, or more generally for the public good? No, the opposite is true. Sharing jeopardizes trust and creates brand risk. But that doesn't mean it isn't the right thing to do, and it doesn't mean that we should stop trying. We haven't shut down Data for Good, but we recognize the brand risk. We continue at Telus to focus on transparency to garner public trust. But with all of that in mind, I'm just gonna, I know it's just an intro, so I'm gonna close off my opening remarks with these three thoughts. As commercial organizations, tech companies require the trust of their customers to continue to exist, to carry on business. Our customers need to share data with us for us to function. By requiring sharing outside of the organization, we end up in a situation where consumers must trust the company, us, as well as trust the government, and potentially an entirely different set of rules or commitments that might be made by that government or other users of the data. And then finally, where trust can be compromised by allowing others to access data entrusted to one organization, there is a risk of a chilling effect on participation in the digital economy. So I'll stop there. Those are kind of three relatively provocative thoughts, I think. And I really do want to hear what others on the panel have to say. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Pam. That was fantastic. Robert, your thoughts?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I always learn a lot when I'm on a panel, not just of other economists, but of folks that come from different disciplines, but both in academia as well as in practice. So again, thank you so much. I always learn a lot, which is great. So the question that Lisa gave us to think about is, the short version is, should there be more access to the data that's held at tech companies? And Lisa was very specific about tech companies. I'll start, I'm going to answer that question, but I want to start off by saying that it's not, that I think this is a question that goes way beyond tech companies. And I think we want to think about all sorts of companies that hold data on us, like our bank or our healthcare provider, our local library for that matter, our internet service provider, right? So there are many, I guess that's a tech company, but so there are many different companies that have data on us. And I think in general, the things we're talking about go beyond big tech. So two broad things. So we've been talking so far about whether the data should be accessed by, let's say sort of researchers, government, civil society. I'll make a case that, or I'll just my answer to that is yes, and I'll sort of describe some of the mechanisms through which I think that can happen. But I also want to point out that there's another whole, realm in which we might want data to be made available, and that would be for competition policy reasons. We could think of many different reasons why we think that companies with data should make that data available to potential entrants, so that potential entrants could use that data to sort of fine-tune their algorithms and things like that. So happy to sort of talk more about the competition policy piece, maybe more in the Q&A. I want to talk about the first piece now, how to have data available to researchers. And frankly, some of these comments are going to echo a little bit of what we just heard about from Pamela. So again, at a minimum, this type of data should be accessed by civil society, and in particular by researchers. I think there's a very important role that researchers, be they economists or demographers or education policy folks, I think there's a very important role that researchers play. So how should this data be made available? I'm going to talk more from a U.S. perspective. I don't know the acronyms of different agencies in Canada, but I look forward to being educated on that. So as I see it, there's sort of three big issues. The first is that companies need to be compelled to share, and they currently are not compelled to share. So where does that authority reside? If it was in the US, it might be something like the Federal Trade Commission, where that authority would reside. So that's sort of the first challenge. Second challenge is, you would need some sort of entity to oversee the process through which the data is accessed. And this could be a government agency, or it could be a third party. If it was a government agency in the US, it might be something like the NSF, the National Science Foundation. Again, maybe it could be the FTC or something like that, but you would need some entity that would oversee the process through which researchers have access to the data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Third is that there would need to be some decision made about where the data would reside. So in Pamela's example, it sounded like the data resided with her firm. That could be one solution, or you could imagine that maybe the data rests, sort of resides in some sort of central repository, again, access to which is controlled by the government or a third party or something like that. So the model that I have in mind here is a model that statistical agencies around the world use to allow researchers to access the data that they have. So the one that I'm most familiar with is the US Census Bureau and IRS. In Canada, it'd be Stats Canada, I believe, or Stats Can that does this. So the US Census Bureau, of course, collects data on people, right? They do this counting every 10 years. We just recently went through that in the US. But also every year, the US Census Bureau and the IRS collects data on firms, including, and this, by the way, sorry, at the firm level, but also at the establishment level, right? Such that every single McDonald's franchise, not just McDonald's Corporation, but every single franchise, data is collected on what the profits and losses were, number of employees, some information about the education of those employees and things like that. So the US Census Bureau collects this data, and researchers, again, be they, they're studying health, maybe they're studying education, maybe labor, maybe innovation, maybe competition policy, can get access to this data, but it's really protected, this data, right? So I have access to this data for very specific and narrow projects. It took me a year to go through the vetting process. It included an interview with the FBI, background checks, fingerprinting, and all sorts of things like that. In order to actually access the data, I have to go to a physical facility. I have 2 different card swipes to get in. It's all password protected. So the point being is that there's a very careful sort of environment that's created around accessing this data. But I would imagine that something like this, a model like this, I think would also work for, let's call it tech company data, where that data is put in some central repository and people are vetted in order to be able to access it. Again, I think that this perhaps sounds a little bit like what Pamela was talking about in the case of her firm, but imagine something like this that's done at scale across a bunch of different companies. So I'll pause there. Again, hopefully the competition policy piece comes up as well, because I would love to talk about that.
Thank you, Robert. And Eric, we can close off our intro panel here.
Thanks. And I enjoyed hearing the comments from the other panelists. I think there are great opportunities to do valuable, socially beneficial research from data that's collected for specific business purposes by the commercial online services. And these commercial data resources definitely could be I think useful for supporting a myriad of research studies by universities, civil society groups, government agencies. For open publications, researchers at Microsoft and academic partners we work with, as well as researchers at other companies, have shown the value of employing anonymized end user behavioral data in accordance with disclosure and opt-in by end users. So you asked about different examples, like, valuable studies can be done with anonymized data about queries and page views captured during search and browsing across the world. And you can read numerous studies listed on our websites and of course, in the academic community. Directions include medical and public health studies, such as understanding depression. One of my favorites, identifying previously unknown drug interactions. We did several publications on that. Studies of the flow of misinformation and disinformation. Where is fake news being ingested intensely, and how does it affect, for example, potentially even voting patterns? As a member of the PCAST Public Health Working Group in Joe Biden's administration, I'd love to see commercial data used to understand the spread of COVID and the uptake of vaccinations. Other studies include gaining more detailed understandings of trends in labor. There's a National Academy study I participated in several years ago on the future of work and automation. We had access to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics data, but it wasn't fine-grained enough. The assessment of our study, we ended up saying, was we were flying blind, we needed data. You can imagine finer-grained anonymized data might be available from LinkedIn, for example, on patterns of employment over the years in recruiting. So the challenge with sharing out data from a company like Microsoft, and this is per Pamela's comments as well, is that data has to be shared and used in a manner in accordance with company commitments to its end users, per usage agreements, transparency, and overall privacy commitments and policies that companies have. Microsoft has very strong privacy commitments, as well as legal requirements like GDPR and others. So we have to have, we have transparent, as Microsoft disclosures to end users, and we comply with federal, state, and international requirements on end user data. The commitments and legal requirements also mean, even for internal uses, data is only kept around for a limited period of time, 12 months, 18 months, depending on the type of data. We have a moving window. Like we had the elections, we were curious about some studies to do and said, well, better act fast because the window is moving. It's evaporating per requirements. So we don't have like gigantic gobs of data that are being accrued in some way along the lines that people might expect. We also need to, in working with finer grained data, we need to take special care with privacy, including anonymization. This is even for internal uses, using privacy preserving technologies like differential privacy, multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption. Popping up a level. So Microsoft, we provide end users with detailed controls and transparency in the data with privacy dashboard, for example. That's the name of this view we give end users. And we allow for different levels of sharing information in return for different levels of personalization in some cases. And we also let users know in our end user licensing agreement that data is used for a number of aspects, not just exactly for the service they're in, including research. And just to give people a sense for how things work at Microsoft Research, any proposed study with the data has to go through 2 reviews, a legal compliance review, and then a fairly intensive Microsoft Research Ethics Review Program or Ethics Review Board that I co-founded several years ago with Duncan Watts. This is the only federally registered institutional review board of its kind in the tech sector. The reviews assure privacy commitments as well as ethical uses of the data. Now, I've been personally, and Microsoft has been actually interested in sharing out data, and I've been an advocate over the years, and we've stood up special programs and we've had good experiences with sharing out large data sets with researchers in a controlled setting. So we create a specially sanitized data set, then we engage the academic community with a request for proposals, an RFP, and we select a community of research teams who are then given license as well as restrictions with analyzing this specially curated data set. For example, we've had maybe 3 times we've stood up programs where we have allowed anonymized search logs to be used by research teams that are licensed to use them. And then we built out communities and held workshops. Researchers share their research, they openly publish the research and so on. So let me just mention a few aspirational directions. I'd love to see innovations that enable the greater sharing of data with researchers from companies like Microsoft. And I'm really open, and I know my senior leaders at Microsoft are really interested in engaging in creative discussions on how this might be done. There might be new kinds of agreements with end users, providing more controls. For example, not just disclosure, but the ability to consent when data specific studies and sharing. Like to see systematic approaches to seeking consent, let's say for a public health study. Of course, we know that with opt-in and opt-out, we end up with challenges with bias in data sets, and that we need to grapple with. There might be other kinds of privacy preserving technologies that let us do more, other innovations. I'll let you one just before I stop. Years ago, I worked on with Kristen Lauder a technology that would allow you end users to create and store somewhere, we can talk about that later, a large amount of their medical data with keys that were structured hierarchically and by subdiscipline. So an end user could hold the key to their own encrypted data, and they could sort of, by request, share out their data with third parties, but specific pieces of it for time-limited purposes, for example. Anyway, with any kind of sharing, we at a company like Microsoft, we would have to have red teams attack the models for privacy to ensure that they are bulletproof, and also communicate the risks and the value to end users about this sharing. So we need to keep it exploring. I'm optimistic. I've enjoyed seeing the proposals over the years, data brokers and so on. And so I'd love to hear more thoughts. And we're open to the ideas. And that's why I was excited to join this panel.
Thank you, Eric. So before I open up to questions from our audience, I thought that I would just run through the four of you again in case there were things that your co-panelists said that you wanted to respond to in some way. Aziz, did you want to add some comments or pick up anyone's thread?
Well, I'll maybe add a comment that anticipates what Lisa had flagged as her subsequent question, which was some of the methodologies through which access might be mobilized. And I'll try and keep it very brief, but I hope provocative. And the comment is this, that at least under US law at the moment, the question of who owns personal data produced by tech companies is remarkably unclear. As a matter of constitutional law, it's not clear whether personal ownership or ownership by a corporate entity is possible. Yes, there are IP protections in the form of copyright and the like, but they don't extend to many kinds of data of the sort that we're discussing. Instead, companies in the tech sector exercise something that looks like ownership through a series of technological and legal tools for control that is substitutes for ownership. The provocative thought is this, that in other contexts where there is a resource that both benefits or could benefit the public at large, and where there are serious externalities, either that accrue to the public in general, or that are potentially concentrated on small groups. One of the instruments that has been deployed to facilitate the minimization of costs and the maximization of social benefits, understood in a roughly welfarist frame, has been public ownership. The doctrine of public trust, which is employed in many common law jurisdictions because it has English roots, is a tool that can be overlaid on the current structures of data flows without changing where data resides in a manner that facilitates and formalizes greater democratic control over both the positive and the negative uses of data. The jurisdictions that have tried to employ something of this sort have not been nation states, which I think are the most logical and efficient vehicles for such a project. They've been municipal jurisdictions. Toronto explored such an option, but ultimately did not execute it. But some European cities have used this for locational data. In my view, in the absence of some sort of legal foundation for much more aggressive regulatory intervention, whether it be for public health purposes or whether it be for the kind of competition purposes that Robert mentioned, we're not likely to see much effective reorientation of data usage for the public good.
Thanks. Pam, did you want to add anything?
Sure, maybe just in response to that, I think it's a little bit dangerous to just talk about data as if it is a resource. Well, in two ways. One, we don't normally just take resources from companies. Like that's not the way we generally do things. But I also think it's not like a natural resource where we have public trusts exactly, in that it requires participation from individuals to create the data, and it requires the technology built by companies to create the data. The company piece is a separate piece, but even just looking at it from the perspective of individuals need to participate in the digital economy, or participate somehow digitally in order to create this data. And so I don't think that we can overlook how critical it is to make sure that citizens can have trust in what it is that they're doing, and saying, we're going to take it and put it somewhere else and use it for a different purpose than the purpose for which the individuals surrendered it and the circumstances under which they surrendered it or created it. I think it's a dangerous idea, and I think it could significantly jeopardize trust in the digital economy. So while I 100% believe and stated earlier that we can be using data for social good, I think we have to be really careful about viewing it as a resource that should just be publicly protected as if it were parkland. It isn't parkland. It requires individual consent and acknowledgement and trust to create it, quite apart from the whole corporate concept of it also requires the technology and the incentives around building the technology.
I love this. I feel like we should have a whole data debate this. Robert, did you want to add some
Yeah,
of your thoughts?
I want to sort of build out the competition policy piece a little bit, and I'm going to do it by just sort of segueing right from what Pamela, Aziz and Pamela were saying. So I think there's also there's a whole lot of middle ground between data only resides in firms, or data is a publicly available resource, and that would be something like data portability, where the individual, right, the user, me, for example, is able to take the data that Telus or Microsoft or Google or whoever might have, and I could port it to somebody else. I could port it to Yahoo, or I could port it to Comcast. And again, this is where it's not just big tech, but also think about my bank. I mean, my bank has a whole lot of data on me. I mean, I think they actually probably have the most valuable data that I can think of. They know exactly how much I make. They know what I spend it on. They know the extent to which I save it or invest it. That's valuable data that I might want to bring to a startup, or I might want to bring to a local credit union. I don't use a local credit union. I use a very large bank, but maybe I would want to take it from that very large bank and move it to a local competitor for a variety of different reasons. And so what would it enable me to do that? Some type of data portability technology would enable me to do it. Now, there are a ton of sort of technical issues around data portability. There are also a whole bunch of other sort of legal issues around the data, and some of which has to do with the things Pamela touched on, which is that, obviously, some of the data perhaps is quote unquote mine. Some of the data, though, was co-created between me and the company, the sort of different things they offered me that I might have chosen between. So how much of it really is my data versus the company's data? So I think inevitably that there needs to be a little bit of legislation that can help us sort out some of that. But I think that data portability sort of falls somewhere in between everything is publicly available and nothing is shared.
Thanks, Robert. And those comments are really timely. In Canada, we have new privacy legislation that's being introduced that proposes to create a framework for data portability, or proposes to create the space to potentially create a framework for data portability. Anyway, Eric, did you want to add?
Yeah, and I would agree with Robert and others, and Pamela as well as Aziz. Look, I mean, as I mentioned, giving end users more control of how they share their data in a way that is in accordance with law and privacy commitments that companies make, I think it's a fabulous idea. And we have ideas. I mentioned one idea with this encryption and decryption controls. You know, the question as to who would build the plumbing and where would data be stored. These are interesting technical questions as well as socio-political questions. Let me just make a comment though on Aziz's remarks. We often think about data and public good with the lens of modern liberal Western democracies, the US, Canada, and like-minded nations. But we cannot assume that in the world. And sharing data, you know, even with companies that are currently, particularly government in place, they could shift to a different government later. It could be very scary to end users, to citizens. We have to be cautious about government control, government access, and so on. And I thought before I stop today, I should just, and we clearly need a few more panels. They can imagine different topics coming out of what we've mentioned here today. But we need to better understand legal gaps and gray areas, such as uses of large-scale commercial data sets collected by third-party companies, used by government agencies these days. And this includes like third parties that can just go out and scrape large libraries of images from the web, location trails of millions of people. You can buy for just several $100,000 right now, like massive logs of, you know, collected through advertising apps and so on off cell phones across motion across North America. Now, there's been great research. Serena Chang at Stanford, now an intern with me this summer, has done research on COVID transmissibility based on mobility data. But given that the government can now purchase this data without a warrant based on probable cause and used for multiple purposes, for example, to build predictive models, is troubling. And I did an op-ed with colleagues drawn from the U.S. Privacy and Civil Liberties Board, P Club, about these gray areas and the need for new kinds of revisions of our laws about government uses of data and the potential legal uses to date, and the potential impact on privacy and civil liberties, calling for a task force. So we need to think through not just the wonders of data, but also all the issues and political challenges and privacy and civil liberties that come with data going to governments, even today's available data that's being sold commercially to government agencies.
Thank you.
I thought I'd do it as a counterpoint with Aziz.
So I will open it up to the questions that we have sending us in the chat here. Donald Wilson, did you want to, hi Don, did you want to ask your question directly, or I can just read it out of the chat?
Well, I think you're doing a fine job. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay. So in the chat, Don asks us, he says that Pam and Eric are representatives of corporations, very open to making de-identified data available under controlled circumstances. Do we have a sense of the openness of other IT companies to permitting access to their de-identified data? And maybe whether you know the details of this or not, maybe also just reflect on, I mean, Telus, Microsoft, you guys are big shops, right? You have a lot of access to expertise to facilitate this kind of access, whereas we see in the EU with their new Data Governance Act, they're proposing to create data intermediaries to facilitate this, like third parties that might facilitate this for companies that don't have the ability to do that, for example, or public bodies. So, what's in, do you have a sense of the openness of other companies and what might be the hesitations or the barriers to that?
Well, I think that I can't make comments on other companies' policies and what they might do or not do. I know, for example, in my work on the board of the Partnership on AI, which involves the large tech companies as well as civil society groups in a balanced board and so on, and projects of various kinds, that my colleagues from the other companies, including Amazon and Meta, IBM, Google, DeepMind, Microsoft, the researchers I know would probably have a leaning towards socially beneficial uses of data sets. As to how that would fly going up the decision-making area, hierarchies of the companies, it's not clear. Also, we have to still, I mean, I said that, I'm leaning in on this, but I would need to work really to make this really happen, to think through like all the issues with trust and privacy and legal compliance, laws in different countries, international companies, they exist across the world and every region has different laws. And so it's not so simple as, oh, we're going to make data available for research. It's the reality of where the rubber meets the road.
Could I follow up on that, Lisa? In some ways, what I'm wondering is whether there could be an equivalent. If we're working with Microsoft, for example, Bill Gates got together with other multi-billionaires to say, we should be paying more taxes. Let's encourage that amongst our colleagues. Is there a way of the IT groups like Microsoft, like Telus, saying, hey guys, this is for good. Let's get together on this.
Just Donald mentioned one comment. There's something called the Civil Air Reserve in the US, where in times of crisis, a set of commercial airlines are leveraged to do something important for the nation, like transport troops around the world and so on, like in World War II. And they give up something, there's a give and take as to how they get involved with these reserves. There's been a discussion of a computing reserve for the future when you need to compute quickly across companies. It's talked about data sets being made available in emergency situations in a shared way with a shared government and technical approach to doing this. You can imagine that in peacetime as well. Just say, I was pointing back to, there's actually active discussions now on like what would be like a civil air reserve across companies and civil society groups and government agencies, and it came to sharing data out for, in times of crisis where it can be used for something important.
I would just follow up on that maybe just a little bit. I think Telus has other programs that are for good. So Internet for Good, Mobility for Good, where we are trying to contribute to the social good and leverage our technology for social good. But the data piece is a little bit different. And for all the reasons that I outlined, it has significant brand risk. And partly maybe that's because we have a legal regime which tells us what we cannot do, but never what we can do. And so you take a risk, and we recognize that we took a risk, and we thought pretty hard about whether, in fact, to make this data available at the outset of the pandemic, because we recognize the brand risk and we recognize the privacy sensitivity and how challenging it might be to explain de-identification. Made the decision to do what we still believe is the right thing. But that's not easy for other organizations to necessarily do. It's very consistent with our brand, but it's not easy. And at the end of the day, we've said a few times, no good deed goes unpunished. We faced a lot of media controversy around it. And I had my day in front of the parliamentary committee. It wasn't all that fun. So we need to think about what incentives we're creating for organizations to do these things, and how to open that up to make it less risky than it is today if we want to create the right incentives. So, I'll leave it there, but I do think, to Don's question, it isn't, there aren't a lot of organizations that are doing this right now, and I can understand why they aren't, both from a financial perspective, but also from a brand perspective. So I think we need to put some thought into that as well.
Thanks, Pam. Robert, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, just two quick comments to Donald's question. So it turns out a lot of companies do share data with academic researchers. It tends to be on sort of a one-off basis, and frankly, unfortunately, it tends to be with researchers at really well-known and well-funded universities who have the time and the legal, sort of the legal team and the wherewithal needed to sort of go in and work with the company to access the data. So one of the potential benefits of a public resource, like what Aziz has been talking about, is that it would democratize access on the part of the research community to this type of data. That's sort of point one. Point two, the other issue with researchers working one-on-one with a company, like Microsoft or like Telus, is, what if the research potentially says something not that great, or something that the company doesn't like? Then there's a little bit of this censoring that potentially can also happen. And again, one of the benefits of what Aziz is proposing is that if the data was held in a public resource, then you would maybe worry less about those types of things happening. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, I wanted to take the question from David Tickle. Did you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to just read it out?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind asking it.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure, great. I think there's a deeper issue here. I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about is how to legally do this or address this dimension of it and so on. This is what I think. What Pamela has really identified a set of cultural phenomena and political phenomena, which really have to do with the fact that we're in a whole new ballgame compared with how we thought about privacy before the arrival of AI and large data sets and so on. And we're in an era of misinformation and a lot of fear. And underlying all this is, I believe, is a literacy issue. And we don't know what that literacy should be as part of the problem. We're sitting here, and even in this discussion, I've heard lots of different views that are saying, well, maybe we should think of it this, maybe we should think of it that way. So it's sort of like we're at a period of a major cultural disconnect. And the question is, what do we do about that? So I leave that to the panel to respond.
Thanks, David. And we can have a rapid fire response in our last few minutes of the panel from this larger view of broad cultural change and shifting data norms. Does anyone want to offer some comments? Pam?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We see that within Telus, and we've used that term literacy quite a lot. And I think that is exactly what we're talking about in this new era. So we have launched a big part of what my office is doing right now at Telus is to launch an overarching data literacy campaign within Telus. But I think we need to expand that more broadly at the social level. And I think that's something that I'm hoping that the government will focus on with the digital charter, that we will look at expanding digital literacy more broadly and bringing the level of understanding about what the implications are of sharing data, how it can be used for good, how it can be used for evil, how it can be protected, what some of these technical terms are, whether we conceive of data as a resource or an asset, or in some cases people talk about it as if it's like an actual biological portion of their body. So how are we going to talk about and conceive of data as a society? And we're all having conversations at cross purposes because we haven't agreed on those fundamental terms, and we don't have literacy when we don't have a common language. So I couldn't agree more. I think this is a really important point. It's challenging enough for us to do this across Telus. It's not a small problem, but it's one we 100% have to tackle. And I think it's a great problem for academics as well as the government to be focused on right now.
Thanks. Aziz?
I agree with both David and Pamela that there is a profound gap between public and expert understandings. I'm maybe a bit more skeptical that gap is bridgeable given the political forces that gain from exploiting it. I would point out or I would emphasize something slightly different. I think that there is still fundamental normative disagreement about what data is and how it appropriately is controlled that has even come out in this discussion. I think that the traditional model of data conceptualizes it as something that is individualized. It's something that individuals exercise control over and can reasonably predict how will be used, and that where data is employed to harm or to benefit an individual, the data in question pertains in the first instance to that individual. And a number of the comments that have been made, I think, hew to this individualized model of data. In my view, at least, the individualized model of data is rapidly becoming outmoded. It's quite clear from research by Helen Nissenbaum, Solon Barakas, and others that individuals are incapable, for reasons of time constraint and intellectual capacity, from understanding the disclosures that describe how their data will be employed. It's implausible to think that data that's collected, whether it be by Eric's company or other companies, will be used in static and predictable ways in the future. One of the great benefits that Microsoft and other companies have brought to the world is that innovation in the ways that data can be used. So on the one hand, it's implausible to think that people either can or do understand or predict the ways in which their data is employed. On the other hand, in a world in which one of data's most important uses is as training data for prediction instruments, it is not the case that the most important implications for an individual arise from the use of their data. Often it will be data that is gathered from other people that will be used to make predictions about you. So both on the production and on the use side, data is inexorably social. To my mind, this difference between thinking about data as individualized and thinking about data as social is a tremendously important and fracturing distinction in the landscape of academics and professionals talking about this world, and one that we ought to think through before embarking on the more difficult task of public education.
All right, so on that note of deep normative disagreement and questions, which is a perfect way to end this panel that could have gone on all day, I'd like to please join me in thanking our panelists for what has been a very provocative conversation. And I hope you all stay for the next session. Thank you, everyone.